The girl was 13 when Roman Polanski, who was husband of Sharon Tate, took her to Jack Nicholson's house. She thought she was going there for photographs. Instead, the 43-year-old director gave her champagne, gave her part of a quaalude, and assaulted her after she repeatedly told him no. Years later, Samantha Geimer would describe it in painfully simple terms. She had been alone, frightened, and unable to make him stop. Polanski was one of the most celebrated directors in America, the man behind Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown. And he was now facing 6 criminal charges connected to what happened to a 13-year-old girl. But the strangest part of the case was still ahead. Polanski did not go to trial and fight every accusation. He entered a plea agreement and admitted to unlawful act with a minor. But things went far more disturbing in years ahead. Before Samantha Geimer, there was Sharon Tate, her wife. By the time Roman Polanski married her in 1968, it was a moment that defined their lives. He was already known for his appetite for women and his refusal to behave like a conventional husband. Tate was 25, Polanski was 34, but the marriage was far less orderly than the photographs suggested. Polanski continued sleeping with other women, and Tate knew about it. She was unhappy with the infidelity. She wanted a marriage. Polanski wanted freedom. He was open about his lustful appetite and did not appear willing to give it up simply because he had married her and used to treat her like a shit. Then Tate became pregnant. She was carrying their first child when Polanski was away in Europe. On the night of August 8, 1969, 4 members of the Manson family entered the house. Sharon Tate was murdered, along with Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent. Polanski survived, and 8 years later in Los Angeles, another young woman would enter his life. This time, she was 13. Samantha Geimer was 13 years old when she was brought into Roman Polanski's world. It began with a photo session. Polanski had been asked to photograph her for a magazine-related modeling opportunity, and on March 10, 1977, he took her to the home of actor Jack Nicholson in Mulholland Drive. According to Geimer's account, Polanski gave her champagne and a quaalude. She later said that he assaulted her despite her objections. She was 13. He was 43. When Geimer's mother learned what had happened, the family contacted police. Polanski was arrested on March 11, 1977. The charges were severe. Prosecutors accused him of 6 offenses: unlawful act by use of drugs, sodomy, lewd conduct with a child under 14, and unlawful act with a minor. Polanski initially pleaded not guilty. Then came the part that would permanently complicate the story. Rather than face all 6 charges at trial, Polanski reached a plea agreement. 5 charges were dismissed, and he pleaded guilty to 1. Unlawful act with a minor. He was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation and was sent to prison for 90 days. He served 42, and when he learned that the judge might send him back to prison after the evaluation, Polanski made a decision that changed everything. He left America. He was not fleeing because the case had been dismissed. He was fleeing after pleading guilty, and from that moment on, Roman Polanski was a fugitive who had left the country before he could be sentenced. He had been born in Paris, held French citizenship, and France would become the country where he spent the rest of his life outside Poland and the United States. The escape transformed the case. Until then, the story had been about a famous director accused of abusing a 13-year-old girl, a guilty plea, and a controversial sentencing process. Now, there was another fact that could never be separated from it. Roman Polanski had fled before the judge could sentence him. American authorities would continue to regard him as a fugitive, and Polanski continued making films. He won awards. He appeared at festivals. He remained one of European cinema's most respected directors. As the decades passed, Geimer herself began speaking publicly about what had happened. Her position was complicated. She did not want Polanski to be imprisoned, and she objected to the enormous amount of attention that continued to surround an event from her childhood. For 31 years, Polanski had managed to live outside the United States without being brought back to court. In September 2009, Polanski traveled to Switzerland to attend the Zurich Film Festival, where he was due to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. Swiss authorities arrested him at the airport. He was 76 years old. The warrant from California had never disappeared. Neither had the conviction he had left behind. Polanski was transferred to house arrest at his Swiss chalet while his lawyers fought extradition to the United States. The case became an international spectacle, with filmmakers and celebrities publicly supporting him, and others arguing that a guilty plea could not simply be erased because decades had passed. The strange part was that the original case was now more than 3 decades old. Samantha Geimer was an adult woman with a family and a life of her own. She publicly asked that Polanski not be imprisoned again. In 2010, Switzerland refused to extradite Polanski to the United States and released him from house arrest. He returned to France. Now other women were beginning to speak publicly about encounters they said had happened when they were teenagers. And one of those allegations went back even further than the 1977 case, to 1972, to a 15-year-old girl. Her name was Renate Langer. The allegation Renate Langer brought forward in 2017 was not about something that had happened recently. She said it had happened 45 years earlier, when she was 15. Langer, a German former model and actress, told Swiss authorities that she had met Polanski in Switzerland in 1972 and that he had a at his chalet in Gstaad. She was 15. Polanski was 38. For decades, she had said nothing publicly. Then, in October 2017, she went to Swiss police and formally reported the alleged assault. The timing mattered. The world had changed since 1972. Women were coming forward with allegations against powerful men, and old cases that had once been dismissed or buried were being examined again. Swiss authorities confirmed that they were investigating Langer's complaint, but there was a problem that had nothing to do with whether they believed her. Too much time had passed. Swiss prosecutors later concluded that the statute of limitations had expired, meaning the allegation could not be prosecuted. There would be no trial. Langer's allegation, therefore, remained an allegation, not a conviction. But it changed the shape of the Polanski story. Samantha Geimer had been 13 in 1977. Langer said she had been 15 in 1972. And other women had also made accusations against Polanski over the years. The question was no longer only about what happened in that Los Angeles house in 1977. It was becoming a much larger question about Polanski's behavior toward young women. Another woman, identified publicly as Robin, said Polanski assaulted her in 1973, when she was 16. She described being invited to his home under the impression that he wanted to photograph her, and later said that what happened there was not consensual. Then came other accounts. Women who had been teenagers when they encountered Polanski began describing experiences they said had been hidden, minimized, or carried privately for years. But the ages kept becoming part of the story. In 2009, after his arrest in Switzerland, Polanski made an attempt to address Geimer directly. He sent her an apology, acknowledging the suffering the case had caused her, and expressing regret for the way his actions had affected her life. Geimer accepted his apology, but acceptance did not rewrite what happened. For years, Polanski's reputation survived partly because European cinema continued to treat him as an important artistic figure. Directors, actors, and other prominent figures defended him, particularly after his arrest in Switzerland. Then, the cultural climate changed. The Me Too movement forced Hollywood and the wider film industry to look again at powerful men accused of sexual misconduct. Polanski's place in that conversation became impossible to ignore. In 2018, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences expelled him from its membership, decades after he had won the Best Director Oscar for The Pianist. The decision did not erase his films. She eventually wrote about her experience herself. She publicly opposed further punishment for him and said that she had forgiven him. That position created its own storm. She married, raised a family, and built a life that existed largely outside Hollywood. By the time Polanski was in his 80s, the original scandal was more than 40 years old. But age had not made it disappear. Instead, every new controversy reopened the same argument. Could a filmmaker's work be celebrated while the conduct surrounding his name was treated as something separate? At the same time, protests followed him. As accusations against powerful men were becoming a global reckoning, Polanski's name was again pulled into the conversation. The older allegations were no longer being discussed as forgotten Hollywood scandals. They were being examined as part of a much larger question about power, celebrity, and the people who had been protected by both. In 2019, the controversy erupted again around An Officer and a Spy, his film about the Dreyfus affair. The irony was impossible to miss. Polanski had made a film about a man caught inside a corrupt system of accusation and injustice, while his own history was once again being fiercely debated in public. He won major awards for the film, and the awards themselves became controversial. Some people saw the recognition as proof that his artistic achievements could survive anything. Polanski lost something when he fled America. He lost the possibility of simply returning home. He could work. He could travel through countries willing to receive him. But the United States remained different. The sentencing he had fled never happened. The legal case remained unresolved from the perspective of American sentencing, and the possibility of arrest followed him whenever he crossed certain borders. Even when he was celebrated, that fact remained underneath everything. He had escaped the sentence. He had not erased it. Roman Polanski's story began with extraordinary contradictions. A survivor who became famous. A brilliant director whose personal life repeatedly became the center of scandal. A man who married Sharon Tate and survived the tragedy that killed her. A filmmaker who reached the highest levels of Hollywood success. And a convicted sex offender who fled before sentencing after pleading guilty to unlawful act with a minor. Then came decades of exile, renewed accusations, arrests, protests, awards, apologies, defenses, and arguments that never seemed capable of reaching an ending. Perhaps that is why the story remains so disturbing. Not because the facts are difficult to understand, but because they are painfully easy to understand. A 13-year-old girl was involved. A famous 43-year-old man pleaded guilty. He served 42 days. Then he left the country before sentencing. And decades later, other women came forward with accusations of their own. The films remained. The awards remained. The photographs remained. The reputation remained. But so did the question that has followed Roman Polanski for nearly half a century. How much brilliance does it take before a culture becomes willing to look away? And perhaps that is the part of his story that will never really end.